Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Mantle Mondays. I'm Amar Varma, the co-founder and CEO of Mantle. Today, I'm joined by someone who has truly seen the life cycle of a startup from every possible angle. Tiho Bajic is a founder, seasoned technical leader, currently a GP at Fifth Quarter Ventures, but beyond all the titles, he's a relentless advocate for founders. He's the driving force behind things like the Open Cap Table Coalition and a bridge builder for global tech ecosystems through Serbian entrepreneurs. Theo, great to have you here. We've got a lot to get into.
Thank you, Amr, for hosting me. Thank you for that warm intro.
We'll dig into it. We'll go through all the details, and I'm sure I've missed a bunch in there as well. Let's talk through this because my experience with you, I've learned a ton just from all of the different things you've done over your career. So there's a bit of time in market, but your approach, thinking of how to do things has always been interesting to me. So I'll start in. You've lived many lives over the course of your career. So kind of take us from the beginning and kind of lead us up to today, because I think that'll serve as a good framework to go through some of the other stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I was 18 when I moved to Toronto. The following year, I went to University of Toronto Computer Science and Math program. At the time, there was this program called Professional Experience Year, which was really available to engineers and not to arts and science students. But somehow myself and several others lobbied. We got included into that. And so I only really had, obviously, I had like one interview in my life and got my first job, which was an internship, and then just held on to it. And then everything since then has been like referrals or working with people who I worked with before. So talk about like the right time, right place, studying computer science at University of Toronto in early 2000s, right when I started. I started working in startups in 2002, 2003. It was a startup in Toronto called WorkBrain, which was at the time one of the fastest growing startups in the country. I was there for their IPO. I believe I was the first R&D intern, and then stayed there for about 6 years when I went and joined a couple of founders of WorkBrain at their following gig, Rypple. I joined as the first engineer. At that point, I was like, okay, I want to be on the I want to be the start of a new adventure. 4 years later, we were acquired by Salesforce. Through that, I managed to through Rypple, I moved to San Francisco to help start the office there. After the Salesforce acquisition, I decided to I like the 0 to 1. So I did that several more times. And the next thing I knew, I was helping an Australian company called Nitro establish offices in San Francisco and scale. And then I started doing that as an advisor. And then the next thing you know, from San Francisco, over a period of a couple of years as an advisory CTO, I helped companies in 10 different countries figure out how to raise money in San Francisco, which led me eventually. I helped everybody except my countrymen, my country folk, and I ended up starting Serbian entrepreneurs to do just that. It's exactly now 10 years ago when I started helping out in a more programmatic way, which eventually led me to, write some angel tickets, do some SPVs, and turn that into a full-time gig. Now that I'm a GP of my own fund. And somewhere in there, I partnered with Eric Ries after his mega success of Lean Startup, and we built the long-term stock exchange together.
Fascinating. There's a lot in there. We're gonna dig in and unpack some of this stuff. One of the key things that you hit on is working globally in epicenters in Silicon Valley. I started my career in Silicon Valley, and every month, quarter back there, every company that's been acquired or acquiring has been headquartered there. Let's dive into that. Why is that a thing? Everybody has a tag for some other thing, and I tell people it's a place you can't replicate. It's kind of a gravitational pull that's gravitationally stronger by orders of magnitude than other things. What's the key thing that you learned and you'd like to just tell people to continue to look at?
I spent more than 10 wonderful years living in San Francisco. My 3 kids were born there. So that place has a very special place in my heart. Multiple, interesting business opportunities that have come and exited and started new ones. One thing that I've learned is that everybody wants to be there because just like in fashion, you want to go to Paris or Milan, right? Like if you're in acting, you want to go to Broadway or Hollywood. Like if you're in deep tech, you really want to go to Silicon Valley, San Francisco. And so there's this arbitrage game that I think is really interesting, which is what is the what are the other places have that San Francisco doesn't have, and how could you help those people get what San Francisco has to offer, and vice versa? What could you get people in San Francisco to like really take notice about that other place, or about that technology, the talent, capital, influence, right? And one of the things in San Francisco, and I especially experienced this working at the long-term stock exchange, when you're in San Francisco, it's really hard not to feel like you're at the apex of like innovation and everything that is going on, and that you have a solution, or that your fellow founder down the road has the solution to everything that's wrong in the world. And it's really interesting when you spend time in DC, or when you spend time in Wall Street, and LTSE was trilingual, right? Like we had to be really good in DC, really good on Wall Street, and really good in Silicon Valley. You realize that everybody thinks that about their relative's place when it comes to exchanges. Like people think that the most important thing is like the regulation. The ones that are in the regulation business, the ones that are in trading, they think, Wall Street is the most important. The ones that are in technology, they think San Francisco is the most important. And so you actually realize that San Francisco isn't the center of the world for everything. And there is something to learn. Being, a lifelong immigrant, and I moved around a whole bunch, like I really leaned into that personally. And so I tried to be really helpful to Canadian founders who are coming to the Valley, to other founders coming to the Valley, and learning from what they have. And then within America, partnering with people who have reached the apex in their own relative respective area, and say like, what can my startup in San Francisco learn from that?
There's two things I'll point out here. One is, and one's a comment, one's more of a discussion. First one's a comment. I think people think about epicenters and then they go through government historically and used to be required in order to enable and fund and permit projects that can create returns. And the digital revolution that we lived through in most of our career has mostly been takers of outcomes. And now we're seeing it flip again in this AI power the 5 layers of the stack with this AI. It's kind of interesting. You're seeing the powers collaborative between the financial people, the government people, and the technology people in this trifecta. It's really interesting to watch, and it's fascinating to see the speed at which you can move at when you all work together. That's my comment. My question is like, there's a scale to which I will always keep with me viscerally from being in Silicon Valley. There's always a length of like founder to CEO of a $100 billion or multi-trillion dollar company that always sticks with me now. And there's a scale, a global universe. I looked it up. Looks like WorkBrain went public in December 2003. Salesforce shortly thereafter. What's your take on why one is still a public company today at very large scale and one is not? And it's not to pick on the company or the size, but just to kind of give kind of the tale of two cities from your perspective, because both were wild success stories, just in a different scale.
Yeah. From my vantage point, having worked at both companies, right? Or I think an interesting thing about WorkBrain and what was happening in the market at the time is that WorkBrain was a large enterprise on-prem solution. And that was a P-backed company called Infor, that at the time I believe was the second or the third largest privately held software company in the world, that was going through a really big acquisition spree to build a competitor to SAP and Oracle, right? And I believe that it was actually backed by a bunch of capital from San Francisco or from Silicon Valley. And so I think what WorkBrain did really well is it showed that it can solve a large problem, really complex problem when it comes to scheduling, payroll, forecasting demand at some of the largest employers in the world, the retailers and so forth. But the implementation time was large, because it was on-prem and it was like highly customized. And, there was this acquirer that was telling and building and still is, executing on that story which is like, let's bring together a bunch of disparate point solutions, put them all on a stack that we can then sell into these large enterprises, which is an alternative to these SAP, Oracle like stories. And so I think it was a great solution. WorkBrain was a great solution. I mean, I worked on it, so it was a great solution um, that could be accelerated by joining a really large firm. But at the same time, it could only be accelerated that much in the on-prem world. And Salesforce was the kind of like literally their first logo. Remember the cloud and the X and all? It was kind of like the opposite approach, which was, obviously, the founder coming from Oracle, right? Benioff, right? Saying like, hey, let's build this thing in the cloud. Happened to be the right trend. Happened to be, like implementation speed, the expansion speed, all of that radically changes with a cloud-based business. And we have seen over the last 15, 20 years, really big move from on-prem solutions to cloud. Now that on-prem is gone or dead. And, obviously with AI, with the latest developments in AI, it's kind of like, kind of like all this new. But I think that's where kind of like it survived. It bet on the right trend. And to me, and that's a learning from San Francisco, is when you're in San Francisco and when you really strike the chord, like you are moving faster than you could have ever thought possible. That's where VCs are great in San Francisco. That's where capital, that's where talent. Like if you really do well in San Francisco, you will unlock this like mode. It's kind of like running, and I'm going to butcher it because my kids play it and I don't know how it's played, but it's like playing Minecraft on like a much faster clock, right? And like it's just like everything changes so much faster.
Clock speed. I think it can come back to clock speed, right? Like you and I are old enough to remember the turbo button on your computer, right? You're like, why would you run in non-turbo mode? I never understood that. It was so clock speed. I think so. There's a clock speed, there's a belief, and there's a scale that I think are really unparalleled. You get to work with some pretty epic people along your journey. I want to give them people a window into their world, in your world on this, because they're legends in my mind. I'll put up the David Stein, David Ossip, Dan DeBow. There's others in there. Maybe just give a quick rundown of working with and understanding, learning from that group.
Yeah. I mean, I've been lucky, fortunate to be in the right time at the right place multiple times in my career. Having worked with the founders before, books were written about them, or before they wrote the books, or before they were doing things that everybody knows them for right now. And it's just a privilege to see somebody come up and kind of learn by direct observation and by direct interaction, right? There's there are so many folks that have really shaped my career and been really influential in that career. I don't know if it's I have a knack for recognizing really great leaders, but I like to call myself the first follower. And I think that really, I'm really trying to apply that as a VC, right? Because as a VC, you don't want to be the center of attention in the room. You want to be the biggest champion, the supporter, the guy who maybe solves some of the problems, makes the right connections, supports the person. And I think being a really good follower is a really hard skill to champion. And, the American myth of he or she is the person who did this and all on their own and whatnot. Like it takes a tribe, takes a village. And you mentioned several names, and I believe that when I work with them, I really try to be their number one follower and to realign my duties, responsibilities, and how I act to further not just the company mission, but their own personal mission. So for like, Eric, I'll be reviewing books. With David Stein, I'll be helping out with technical due diligence, or networking with somebody else. I'm going to be running meetups and conferences. And so I try to really be that person, because I feel like if you surround yourself with really great entrepreneurs and you're their number one follower, their number one supporter, they're just going to open up so many amazing doors and going to take you places, which doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion of your own or you don't do cool stuff. But I think it's just like my observation about San Francisco, where everybody tries to be at San Francisco and there's myopia in San Francisco. I think there's also like this huge opportunity about being number one follower for some great entrepreneurs. And you get to learn a lot, you get to influence a lot, and you have an impact. I don't think that many people who take that as a career choice like I have.
I think it's super interesting to spend a bit more time on this, because I think people always think they've gotta have the Elon jersey, and Elon wasn't a company of one. Obviously he was the outlier there. I look at somebody like Tim Cook. Obviously the half-life of everything Jobs did in the last, decade before he took over, and his death um was huge. The company's become way more valuable under Tim Cook. And the question is that half-life end in this current phase? So, I look around and I see very, 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 very successful people in their career that have been the number one supporter, and kind of always been the first go-to of like, hey, let's talk about this thing, and the trusted person. And no team works without those, and they're usually just as important, or sometimes even more important.
Yeah, and I think it's a really big opportunity because most people books aren't written about it. It's not this thing that is really popular. You don't get hero status doing that. I think that's that negative space where you can really make impact.
And those people generally at scale have such command of culture, influence, and decision process, right? It's really interesting. Let's
Absolutely.
um let's flip gears just a bit. At Nitro, founding CTO to global organization. What are some of the learnings from there, and a good one, and then maybe a mistake that you can share, and help us understand?
Yeah. It was by the time the company went public, it was something like 60+% of Fortune 500 companies were customers, right? So we really had true global scale and global reach. We had actually done it for remark. It took a while, but we were extremely actually capital efficient. We didn't need to raise all that money to do document productivity at web scale, both on the computers as well as in the cloud. And so one thing that I learned was just how long it takes to implement something that is approved by a CIO at a large enterprise, and just kind of like what you go through all of that. I kind of knew that from WorkBrain, and I knew that from Rypple. But when you are the CTO, and when you always, I learned to like literally as an engineer, like I'm overconfident in my own skill, or I'm overconfident at projecting to my CEO on the board how long certain things are gonna take. Because enterprise is just the beast, and just there's all these things that you kind of learn on the way. So that was like one brutal learning that just like always took longer. But in hindsight, like we did some amazing things on the time horizon when we did, and I stumbled into this multiple times. Um, what I realized was, and we were somewhat early on at this like freemium model. We actually did document productivity and freemium and APIs and all that before Adobe did, before there was HelloSign, because before some of these other providers. Um, when I look back at what we did well, and kind of what I think as a VC these days, what is really important, it's a lesson learned about distribution. What's your distribution engine, right? Some people talk about it as engine of growth. I really like narrow it more into distribution. Because it's really rare that you're going to have, especially in the enterprise, like a viral thing or anything like that. It's like, what's your distribution? And we happen to have coincidentally unlocked something that had a really big impact on us. And I think there's always that hack that if you work long enough in an enterprise enterprise software app, you're going to figure out your distribution hack. And for us, it was like this kind of like free online suite of tools where we have bought a number of very specific URLs and optimized landing pages for SEO. And we were getting people at large banks to sign up and do all kinds of document productivity for free. And they were doing that with their bank accounts, right? And we were able to then run some analysis and realize if there was a sensitive document, and then we would go and reach out to that company and be like, hey, do you know you have an issue. The first lesson learned there is like distribution, figure out how you're going to get there. And the second one is like, what are you selling? At first, we thought we were selling document productivity, which is, yeah, okay. But when you're selling a compliance risk resolution, all of a sudden there's budget for that.
Yeah, I think you say it in there, and I'll tease it out just a bit more with you. It's like, you know, there's no magic sauce for product led growth or sales led growth, right? Like, you really got to think through the building blocks of like, okay, what are we selling? Who are we selling it through? And then the the PMF, product market fit. People spend a lot of time on thinking about how that is. How does it get shaped? And I actually think there's one other element behind it that's like, why are people buying this? Is it like a painkiller, vitamin, compliance? So, like, what are the reasons people have to go buy this? And it's like productivity is the is like the brass ring that gets sold at the start, but is usually not the reason that people end up using these products. That's been my experience on this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Next up, Salesforce, Ripple. I was a small part of that journey as investor, and I had a chance to see the product in action at some of our customers, which was nice. We used it as well. Talk a bit about consumerization of enterprise, and maybe give people some timelines of years and how this thing kind of
Yeah.
came together.
Yeah. So it started in early 2008. And at first, we were building a bunch of point solutions, which eventually amounted to, people performance management suite. These days, there would be a combination of, back in the day, it was companies called like Success Factors and whatnot that were doing something similar. These days, you have companies like Culture Amp, for example, doing that, and others. It was kind of like a pain point that Dan DeBow and David Stein were trying to solve from WorkBrain, which is when at the end of the year everything would grind to a halt because we were trying to do this performance review, comp review, all of these things, right? And so kind of like, is there a smarter, better way of doing that? Right. And we're like super fast growing company and we're publicly traded. It's just like it becomes like a really big issue, right? Like fairness, paper trails, and all of this. Uh, and so we're like, is there a better way of doing it? And we just ended up building point solutions for people we knew, which is other tech companies. And we happened to have signed Facebook when there were like 100 or 200 engineers in total, and just kind of see them grow and then solve problems at each stage of their development. And we've done that with LinkedIn. At the time, LinkedIn was a small company, Spotify. So we did that with multiple now juggernauts. By the time there were only a couple hundred people, but growing super fast. It was a fantastic journey, which we realized at one point. We realized that what we were actually doing is this consumeration of enterprise, and we're now considered like an OG of that. And at the time, the first big exit in that era was Yammer, that was acquired by Microsoft, I believe. And then all these companies, they were starting to come out. They were trying to apply the Twitter 140 characters, this whole thing. And so like, I was the first engineer. I ended up doing a bunch of leading our growth efforts. And so I was, meeting with all the people that were doing at the time. There was not even called growth hacking, but that was the thing that was going on. And I think that was the actual thing that really had a huge impact in the success of that business, because we were very early in terms of market being ready for a different way of doing performance reviews, for managing people differently, because all these companies that now do things differently, they were maturing at the time, and we needed to mature with the market. But being able to deploy the firm and get really quickly spread out through these like social interactions that happen, I think really helped convince Salesforce like, hey, there's something here, and we need to have a solution. We need to have an answer for this. And I think it was like fairly a good match with efforts they were doing at Chatter, and their goal to become like a Salesforce sales department's performance management solution.
Well, very, very cool. And then, Salesforce, we covered a bit already, just in terms of the scale and the transition from on-prem to off-prem. Then you got a real taste for private assets. So maybe talk about Eric Ries and the LTSE and the Open Cap Table Coalition and those initiatives.
Yeah, so Eric was actually a consultant at Ripple. When even before I moved to the Valley, we were really big readers of Startup Lessons Learned, which was Eric's blog before he published the Lean Startup book. He had these, lectures with Steve Blank and was openly talking about it. So we got to actually meet him, and we were applying a bunch of these like startup lessons learned. As I said, we were like really current, and that's one thing I really learned at Ripple, become a student of entrepreneurship, right? And so Eric and I connected really on that, right? Because he's the number one, author on entrepreneurship and startup management. And so after the success of Lean Startup, he wanted to take one of the ideas in the book, the long-term stock exchange, and build a company with the same name and solve a bunch of problems with short-termism in the public markets, but also transform the way startups are being built, grown, and then eventually taken public, right? And I thought it was an audacious mission. As a student of entrepreneurship at the time, I was reading like one entrepreneurial big book a week. And I was like, it was my thing. And so it's like, okay, this is as big of a problem as any. Area under the curve is huge. End up starting as a nights and weekends project. Um, until we realized, no, we actually need to go build a real stock exchange. The name is the thing. And we thought there's like hacks or we could do different things, but it's like, no, we need to be SEC approved, proper stock exchange for all the reasons. And then as we knew that was going to take for a long time to build, to get the license, to build the exchange, to build the program, we wanted to work with entrepreneurs at each stage of their journey. So we went through YC, we went through Techstars. We actually ended up working with YC and Techstars back office teams. We ended up building a bunch of tooling that would help during investment period, during preparation for demo day, cap table management, cash management. We ended up building a platform that more than 60,000 startups used one way or another. It was, I believe, at the time, the biggest startup platform. And then we started realizing, because LTSE mission, long-term stock exchange, LTSE, because of our mission to really help founders, build lasting businesses in the long run and have impact, and trying to solve, core problems along the way. I started getting more and more pulled into governance issues. And you end up realizing that there's a whole bunch of things that people don't, it's like founders get too busy, they don't solve for. But they happen to be around compensation, they happen to be around equity rewards, they happen to be around cap table structures. And so I ended up really digging into that space, building a bunch of solutions. And when I realized that there are no standards, that each law firm does it differently, different VCs. This was even before NVCA kind of came out with their stuff, their templates, or when they were just coming out. I saw that there were no standards. So I started organizing some of the top law firms in the country, some of the VCs, some of the practitioners, to actually start putting in the standards, which led me down a path to start several organizations that deal with standards in governance.
It's amazing. It kind of takes somebody to have found their way and wound their way like you did to become, enough privilege of hindsight and insight to do it.
That's right. Like, had I known this is how long it was going to take to build a long-term stock exchange, or to build some of the standards or around cap table encodings, or how comp is managed with startups, I probably wouldn't have done it. I probably wouldn't have signed up for it. But like, how hard can it be? Like, I need this as a founder of my startup. Literally, that was like, we started joking, like, how hard can it be? That was like a tagline. When we knew we were embarking on a project that was going to be far harder or bigger. It's like, how hard can it be?
You can flip back earlier in this session where you talk about things take longer than they should.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my entire life's
Well,
work.
let's flip gears now. Talk about what you're doing now, because it's fascinating to me. You've had the global perch from many different places. Maybe talk about your current chapter, your current journey, and why it's so exciting, and why this next era can really take off in what you're doing.
Well, I think it's my life's work. I left my hometown in Croatia when I was 9 because of war, and ended up being a immigrant and refugee, and you just traveled the world due to circumstances, and you end up meeting some wonderful insanely entrepreneurial and impactful people along the way. And you realize that not all of it has to be done next to Montgomery Station in San Francisco or something like that, right? And what's happening right now with the AI revolution is it's even bigger, obviously, in terms of just like how easy it is to start a startup than cloud was, right? And so I think if you just assume, which I think no one's going to dispute, that talent is globally evenly distributed, including entrepreneurial skill and whatnot, I really try to focus on entrepreneurs who are kind of like in these corners of the world that maybe are overlooked, or people who are working on insanely hard problems that no one thinks are possible, like the one we did at Long-Term Stock Exchange. And that's my tribe. And I try to be their first follower. I try to be the person who is helpful, not just the capital, but with all the connections and all the experience and the fact that like I'll roll up the sleeves and do the work. And so that's kind of like my MO as a VC. And it's been wonderful to be able to travel the world and meet some of the greatest entrepreneurs around the world. How I came back.
That's amazing. I talk about this a lot as a framework. There's uh, you know, mainframe terminal and the widths and depths of the terminal to mainframe interactions change over time. But mainframe, PC, browser, mobile, cloud, broadly AI. We'll get into what that means, but I feel like we're at the start of a very strong cloud presence in AI and a very thin client, which may change over time here. We'll see. Talk a bit about why this is such a global game now and what some of the opportunities are that you're looking at globally, because it's fascinating to me, and we've had great discussion on this. So maybe share some insights.
Yeah, like we all have this in our pocket, which is an awesome distribution platform, and it's also awesome access platform. And so when somebody in San Francisco pushes a button that makes the latest AI infrastructure available, all of a sudden we can use it, here within half a day or something like that around the globe. It's never been the case before, right? Like if you remember when I was talking about WorkBrain, in order to install our solution 20 years ago, you had to have the data center, you had to have like access to like all of these things, right? Like were really, really hard. These things become much easier. Like even with some of the SaaS stuff that we're talking about, like some of the access and the distribution of technology wasn't as quick and as doable, just fundamentally as you have right now. And I think we're reaching this really interesting thing where you can have, how in programming languages you have the first generation and fourth generation languages, like levels of abstraction. And now I think we can, for the first time, have actually languages that write other language, or like, programs that write other programs. And I think that's just like fascinating. And I've been meeting founders that in a matter of weeks end up launching something and having multi-million dollar business overnight. Being really clever about how they do the entire business stack, where they write code that writes other code, where they do all these things. And I think it's really fascinating. It's going to take some time to obviously play out. But a number of my startups are applying some of that technology into areas where people usually haven't looked at all.
Let's get into just some of the Serbia specific stuff here, because everybody I've met in my lifetime whose last name ends in IC, whether they're from generally former Yugoslavian states, whether it's Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro. I'm sure I'm going to miss some folks in there, so apologies. But like, they're all wicked smart and wicked ambitious.
Yeah,
And I
and good looking and funny and
all those
yeah,
things,
all
right?
this.
And there's just culturally obviously been a push for generations of like, get educated, be smart, right? And that's one.
Absolutely.
To the ambition, and I don't know if it's due to displacement and war, but like the ambition is next level. Maybe talk a bit about that and how folks are repatriating, like yourself, that are creating this kind of global ambition.
If I go back to my childhood, right? A country was called Yugoslavia, and you look at the Olympics, you would turn on the TV and, Yugoslavia would be playing Argentina in World Cup soccer, right? Or Yugoslavia would be, beating USSR in basketball, or going, toe to toe with the American Dream Team, right? And so you just grow up, and a bunch of the infrastructure in Africa, Middle East was actually built by engineers from Yugoslavia. A bunch of fighter pilots I actually met in my life around the world actually trained on planes that were produced in Yugoslavia. That doesn't exist anymore for various reasons, but like we had a really, really interesting kind of like this proud spirit. Like we could build anything. It was like the biggest, smallest country in the world. And it's kind of continued, right? Like if you look at basketball, Nikola Jokic, you look at tennis, Novak Djokovic, like you look at football, you have Luka Modric, you got the Wimbledon hat, football, you look at Luka Modric, like you basically have people from this region be number one in their relative sport, no matter how insanely competitive it is. And per capita, that's just insane. Like it's just, we're not that big of a country or region, right? And so you grow up on the street believing that you can be next, you name it, NBA or football or tennis player. And like my thing is, if you believe it, and you then obviously need to have a whole system that uh, um, Serbia, Croatia have some of the best coaches, right? For sports and whatnot, and a system and whatnot. But anyway, but it starts with that fundamental belief at a very young age. Americans have this wonderful thing about American exceptionalism. They believe they can build the best, solutions, best in, some of the engineering feats, in the last century were done by that. But if you just start with that belief, you can actually go a really long way. And I believe that just like we have, per capita, most professional MBA, like all of these things, like we can actually have for entrepreneurs. It starts with the belief, and it starts with a lot like nurturing that talent, putting it into the right environment, and actually looking at the success, the insane success some of the entrepreneurs of my generation have had around the world. And like literally the way it's been done on, TikTok or Instagram, these reels that are created to talk about, celebrities. You can have that about entrepreneurs, and you'd be surprised how many insanely great entrepreneurs come from this world. And I think we can do it. And it's my bet on this region, and the bet on my people.
Amazing. I'll add a couple things in here because I think it's really seminal. When I talk about the things my parents worked on when they moved to Canada, is like, my dad was a civil structures engineer. You know, they worked on the St. Lawrence Seaway. The Expo 67 Big Dig Island in Montreal. CN Tower. Things like this. But those are yesteryear, a long time ago. And cultures that have had to rebuild recently have created a new resilience around, let's just do it big, do it the best. And I really feel like when I see those types of people that have those types of ambitions, really great things can happen. And especially when they're linked arm in arm with somebody else who thinks the same, and that arm in arm stretches halfway around the world, it becomes a really powerful network. So really, really hats off to you on that. So I'm excited to see more of the things that are coming out of your ecosystem and sphere. And we'll obviously all come see you soon. Let's kind of get through some, you know, two more things. One, maybe spend a bit of time on what you're looking at now as a GP. What's your structure? And then kind of what does the recipe of success look like to start these days?
I mostly invest early stage, pre-seed seed. I look for.
Pause you. What does pre-seed seed mean in 2026?
That's a good one. Before really significant commercial traction, but either it's a repeat founder that has done something that no one else can do in or has an insight in the particular thing where I'll go in even before product, or they have a product that I could run tech DD on, or project that I can run tech DD on, and I'm like, this is just out of this world. That's kind of what I consider pre-seed seed.
Check sizes that come with that now?
I've invested anywhere from $500,000 to 4 or 5 million at the stage. I tend to like, too much money is not a good thing, too little is not a good thing. I don't know what the Goldilocks is. It's like it's somewhere in there. But I think you need to raise enough just to have 2 years or thereabout to go really prove something. Raising too much, you can give yourself false sense of security, and raising too little, you then have to go back and just keep doing it, which is not what you should be. The goal of raising my money isn't to go spend time on their own raising somebody else's money, right? So gotta have the right check size. But some of the seed rounds have been, depending on how capital intensive it is, I've been in some really large seed rounds, which I don't think have historically ever been the case before. But yeah, so that's kind of
I
that's what I do. And
see rounds now of 50, 100, and I'm like,
yeah,
it's a different game.
yeah.
So we talk a bit about like, so that's your spot. That's where you're starting from. Like, what are some of the things that catch your eye and some tips for folks?
I look at, mostly it's a bit of a founder slash space bet. And so I look at what's the total area under the curve. Like if they're successful, how big can this be? And then are they the best person to do this? It's kind of like it's very fairly simple. The more I do it, the more it kind of comes down to that. And the more I do it, the more I'm interested in things that nobody else is like really looking or doing. So I have a growing portfolio in various compute technologies. Not all of them are going to prove out correct approaches, but each one of them are insanely difficult. And I think there's like a huge, historically speaking, like just where I'm calling you from today, in like a 5 mile radius, there's 10 world-class companies that have chip design here. And I'm looking for people who have an insight into the next thing they want to do.
Amazing. All right, wrapping up. I've got some quick hits for you. Ready?
Absolutely.
What's the one skill every CEO needs but is never taught in school or in life?
Don't be the hero.
It's a good one. Want to expand on that? I like that one.
You read books, whether they be fiction or whether they be business, about here's Steve Jobs, here's like this hero who did this, or there was this company was staring at the precipice and Amr did this amazing thing and saved the company. And it's really Amr and like the rest is involved. And I think it has huge issues and repercussions on humbleness and just like understanding who you are, what you are, kind of where you land, and leads into all kinds of like governance issues and hubris issues. And no one actually talks about it, but I really shy away from the founders who think that they're the only ones who could do the thing, which may be true, but they also know the way to do the thing, which is mostly never true.
Got it. Very cool. Last book that you read?
I happen to be a early reader for Eric Ries's new book, Incorruptible, that's coming out in May, and it's amazing. And I've read like 5 versions of it, so I'm done reading like business books for a bit, just because it took some late nights. But yeah, it's a wonderful book.
Watch for that one. And then finally, 2036. What do you want your contribution to have been over the last decade?
It's a good one. Yeah, you're speaking at you and a bunch of real entrepreneurs I appreciate and have learned from and consider remarkable. Are coming out to this part of the world, Adriatic region, and really seizing the opportunity when it comes to talent, when it comes to just access and mindset that we got going on here. And it's like, people knew Dublin or Lisbon because of Web Summit, but like the next kind of thing I wanted to be from here.
Amazing. I will close it there and thank you for your time and great insight. I think there's a lot to be learned from listening to this and watching this one. So thank you for all you do and appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Amr, for giving me the platform. Thank you.